people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, they assume that the natural person is the civilized creature that you see before you in a discussion like this. But I don't believe that. I think that people are far crazier and far more destructive and far greater as well than the typical rationalist approach. Rationality is a surface facade. That's all. And the idea that people will eventually be rational, it's much more likely that they will be irrational than rational. And you could say, for example, that Catholicism, let's say, for all its irrationality, was as rational as people can get. If you remove that level of irrationality, that's structural, say, then everything falls apart and people get so irrational you can't believe it. Not more rational. You know, because they, like Harris and his crowd, think that we were superstitious for thousands of years. Kind of savage and superstitious. And then all of a sudden the Enlightenment came along in the scientific revolution, and poof, we got rational. And since then things have been good. And that's not how it looks to me at all. I don't buy that. I think that our rationality, as I said already, our rationality, even our science, is nested inside this larger metaphysical structure. This is also something that Carl Jung would be an advocate of. That there's an irrational, pragmatic, I would say evolutionarily determined ethic underneath this rationality. And when it goes, then all that rationality goes too. So, yes, you can be a non-believer. But the funny thing about that is, too, you can't be a non-believer in your action, you see, because Harris's metaphysics is fundamentally Christian. So he acts out a Christian metaphysics, but he says, well, I don't believe it. It's like, well, yeah, you do, because you're acting it out. You just say you don't believe it, but you believe it.
What do you mean he's acting it out? Like what, for example?
Well, he doesn't rob banks, doesn't kill people, doesn't rape, doesn't murder, you know. I mean, look, in Crime and Punishment, for example.
So you think when you don't do those things, basically the underpinning of it, even though I think, I can't speak for Sam, and you guys have had, by the way, regardless of where we get with this, you guys have had, I think, two great conversations. One where you didn't quite get there, but one where you've come together. And I suspect you both really relish in that, right? I mean, at the end of the day, this is someone that you respect, whether you disagree with or not.
Oh no, look, I mean...
Yeah, I just think that's important to preface, because everyone is so at each other's throats all the time, that when I saw two people that I respect just disagreeing on things, but really trying to get there, I thought, this is good. And yet there's a certain amount of people that that want you guys to tear each other apart.
Well, there's a good case to be made for atheism. I mean, let's make no bones about it. I actually think it's an easier case to make than the alternative, because you could say, in some sense, there's been 300, 400 years of brilliant scientists who've been doing nothing but laying the foundation for an objective, empirical atheism. So it's an unbelievably powerful argument, but it's not going to lead to the rule of rationality. See, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. Because
do you think anything could get you there? Do you think that somebody could lay out a case that could eventually turn you on this the same way you would want someone like Sam to come around to what you're saying? Do you think that's even in the realm of possibility?
I can't see how, because it's not like I haven't thought these things through. I mean, I am a scientist. You know, I understand the scientific worldview. In fact, everything that I am saying and thinking about religion is nested inside an evolutionary viewpoint, an evolutionary biology viewpoint, and an evolutionary psychology viewpoint. So I do believe there's a fundamental contrast between a Darwinian worldview and a Newtonian worldview, which is the worldview that I think Sam Harris and his crowd basically have. He didn't agree with that, and it's complicated.
Yeah.
But see, I guess in some sense, I'm more romantic in temperament than Sam, and I think than his followers too. And because of that, I can see the irrational and malevolent side of human beings, I believe, much more clearly than they can. And I also think I have far more experience with that sort of thing.
Yeah, so do you think that, so I don't want to get too lost here, but so we'll try to wrap it up here, because there's so much I want to do with you here. So let's say Earth is crumbling, we have two ships. We're going to send the people that believe what you're saying here, basically, that we need this sort of religious underpinning. And then the Dawkins, Sam people, they're going to take their 100 people, you're going to take your 100 people. We're going to go to 2 different planets and set things up the way they should be. You know, blank slate for each. I guess the part that I would struggle with here is to understand how their ship lands, they're rooted in science and in basic liberalism and acceptance of others and all that, how that society would not flourish from the base level if we could just reset. Now, I think you could make a great argument that we can't do it here because there's just so much history here and all that stuff. But if we were just resetting on another place, why could we not do it that way and have it work?
Well, first of all, you know, there's an assumption that science and the scientific worldview in some sense has won. You know, and because it's so self-evident, let's say, because of what it can produce, that people just will accept it and move forward with it. But I'm not sure about that either. I mean, I think there's a strong anti-science movement afloat now. I don't think there's any reason to assume that a scientific attitude of that sort would be stable. I mean, it's only 300 years old, 400. I mean, people don't like it when I say that because, okay, fine, you can chase it back to some degree to the ancient Greeks, you know, barely.
Right.
But really, it was Newton and Bacon and Descartes, and that's not very long ago. And we take it for granted, but there's anti-science movements popping up. Well, look, the whole debate over biology, to some degree, is profoundly an anti-science movement, and not unconsciously so, consciously so.
Yeah,
right?
very consciously.
Yes, very
so,
consciously so.
Yeah.
So I don't think that there's any reason to assume something like that would be stable. There's no evidence that it's stable, let's say. Whereas there is evidence for the stability of cultures that were non-scientific for thousands of years, millions of years for that matter, at least hundreds of thousands of years.
There was a lot of war and death involved in those cultures too, but that's sort of...
Yes, definitely.
But I guess that would be your argument, is that this is just the nature of this battle between these two worlds that we live in.
Yeah, well, you know, the other thing that often happens with Dawkins and Harris and their crew is that they attribute war and conflict to religious motivations. You know, and I find that quite interesting because, first of all, chimpanzees go to war. So, you know, we could just lay that right on the table and say, well, so much for the religious theory. They're territorial. We're territorial. You could consider religious sentiment as an aspect of territoriality, but the fundamental motivation for the battle is territorial. And that's grounded in, like you can see that in animals always. That was only discovered, you know, the chimps went to war in about mid-70s and Goodall suppressed it for quite a while because she thought maybe she had warped the chimpanzees by provisioning them, and so that they were manifesting abnormal behavior. But they were studied for quite a while, and they do raiding, and they'll wipe out another colony, no problem, and brutally. They seem to have absolutely no inhibitions on their aggression whatsoever. They'll tear them into pieces. And chimpanzees are about 6 times as strong as an adult male. They're super strong, and so when they let loose, they're vicious with no control. And so, unless you're willing to attribute religious sentiment to the chimpanzees, which I think you could to some degree, by the way.
How can we make that jump for a chimpanzee?
Well, because the precursors to religious belief are in place. So, for example, animals organize themselves into a hierarchy. You could call it a dominance hierarchy, but it's not exactly the right way to conceptualize it, because dominance sounds like power, right? And that's sort of the social justice warrior postmodernist claim that all hierarchies are based on power. But Frans de Waal, who's a Dutch anthropologist who studied chimps for a long time, has noted that the brutal chimp dictatorship tends to be unstable and end in a very violent, mean manner. Well, so if you're a brutal chimp leader and you're always tormenting everyone and you don't do any reciprocal grooming and you don't have any friends, then one day 2 chimps who are nicely bonded together, 3/4 your size, wait and ambush you and tear you into pieces. And so one of the things de Waal has noted is that the stable chimpanzee troops tend to have a leader that's quite pro-social. A lot of friends, a lot of social bonds, a lot of mutual grooming. And so you could see even there, imagine that there are sets of hierarchies among chimpanzees, and there's different principles of leadership at the top. Then you could imagine a competition across time. Which principle of leadership is going to produce the most stable and functional chimpanzee hierarchy? Well, that is exactly what does happen. And so there's some there's some shape that the top of the hierarchy starts to take, and you could think about that as the beginnings of an ideal. It's even more complicated than that, because let's say you get a stable hierarchy set up, and then this is what happens in human beings. It doesn't happen in chimps, or it does, but only to a limited degree. You get a stable hierarchy set up, and then there's some pattern of behavior that emerges that reliably moves men to the top of that. Okay? They leave more offspring. So what happens is that the male dominance hierarchy, the male hierarchy, forget about dominance, the male hierarchy becomes a selection mechanism. It promotes men to the upper ranks, and then the women peel off the top, because we know that human females do that. Chimpanzee females don't. They're promiscuous maters. The dominant males are more likely to mate with the females, but that's because they chase the subordinates away. It's not because the females are choosy. So the reason I'm telling you this, it's really important, because imagine that there's a reliable pattern of behavior that will move you up a male hierarchy across time. Well, what that means is that men over time have become biologically adapted to that pattern. The hierarchy is there, it's stable, it exists across millions of years. And so it acts as a selection mechanism by promoting men. And so the men who have the genes that are most likely to get them promoted put those genes forward. And so we get more like the group ideal as we progress through time, both biologically and culturally. And then we also start to articulate that group ideal. And that's partly what a religion does when it's coming up with the idea of an ideal. There's a distinction made between countries that rule by the ruler, who's God, and countries that are ruled by God, who's not the ruler. Okay, so strip it for a minute of its religious language, and imagine this instead. Imagine that what we consider God is the abstraction of the ideal by which people have to orient themselves to produce a functional society. It's an abstraction, right?
So it's just sort of the basic underlying truth of how we are able to function as a group of people.
Yes, properly. And you can't identify it with any one person, because when you identify it with the person, then the system gets corrupted, because the person gets inflated, let's say.
This would be like the Pharaoh, basically.
Yes, precisely like that. That's exactly that's the canonical story in the Old Testament. Is the Pharaoh is the earthly ruler who demands everything that you should provide to God. Well, what's God? Well, we can speak about it from an evolutionary psychology perspective. God is the idea of the abstract ideal, and you separate it out from the actual ruler. Just like in our society, the idea of sovereignty is abstracted from the president, right? The president comes and goes. The sovereignty of the president remains. The sovereignty of the president is a very abstract idea, because it's disembodied, right? It's disembodied. Now, we were chimps, for God's sake. How long do you think it took us to figure out how to disembody the idea of sovereignty from the individual? Man, it was like, well, it was maybe up until maybe it took us till 150,000 years ago to start formulating that, you know, in some articulated way, in some abstract way. I think we could recognize it before then, and the way you recognize it is through admiration, right? If you meet someone that you admire, there's someone you want to imitate, and what it is, imagine this pattern that will move you up the hierarchy, and then you see people who manifest different elements of it. And you see someone who manifests an element that you don't have, and something in you responds to that with admiration. It's unconscious, right? Because it pulls you towards them. It's not voluntary. You see that really with kids a lot when they hero worship someone and start to imitate them.
Right.
You know, but the same thing happens throughout culture.